Hello, I'm Babita Sharma. Welcome to Outside Source. Tonight we start in America, where President Trump is not having a good day. The Supreme Court has ruled against him for the second time in a week. He's making a last-ditch effort to stop the publication of a damning new book by his former national security advisor. And Facebook says it's taken down some of his ads for breaking its policies on hate speech after they contain symbols associated with Nazism. As usual, we'll also bring you developments on the coronavirus pandemic from all over the world, including BBC research that suggests at least 130,000 more people have died during the pandemic than official figures show. And we'll take a deep dive into track and trace systems as the UK announces it's ditched its existing plan in exchange for one created by Apple and Google. Welcome to the programme. So we're going to start in the US, where President Trump's had a tricky 24 hours. First, the Supreme Court has ruled against his attempt to get rid of a programme that protects hundreds of thousands of immigrants who entered the US illegally as children from deportation. It's called DACA. It stands for Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. It was created in 2012 by President Obama. In 2017, the Trump administration tried to rescind it. Well, now the court has ruled 5-4 to uphold lower court rulings that found that move unlawful. Chief Justice John Roberts described the administration's actions as arbitrary and capricious. This is the second Supreme Court ruling against the Trump administration in a week. President Trump tweeted, "Do you get the impression the Supreme Court doesn't like me?" Well, it's worth pointing out that he appointed two of those justices, Neil Gorsuch and Brett Kavanaugh, and that ideologically it currently leans towards the Republicans. Well, these were the scenes outside the Supreme Court when the ruling was announced earlier today. Let's hear from one of the Dreamers. That's the name given to those undocumented youths being brought to the US as children.
I've had DACA since I was 15, 16 years old. It's allowed me to go to college. It's allowed me to get a full-time job. That could have all been stripped away had the court decided differently today.
Well, here's our North America correspondent, Anthony Zerko, on the significance of today's court decision.
Considering that Donald Trump back in 2016 ran on the fact that he would be able to remake the federal judiciary system in a conservative image, put conservative judges on these courts, to see two very high-profile cases at the Supreme Court go against him has to be discouraging. Both obviously were close decisions. Both involved some conservative judges breaking over and siding with the more liberal judges. In this particular case, this DACA case, it was decided essentially on a technicality. The Chief Justice, John Roberts, said that while the president does have the power to rescind this DACA program, the way he did it, without crossing all the T's and dotting the I's, without having proper justification, that violated a 1940-era law that said you have to explain your administrative actions and provide grounding for them before you can go and make them.
Anthony, stay with us because I want to talk about another thing that's on the president's mind. The Trump administration is making a last-gap attempt to stop the publication of this book. It's the memoirs of the former national security advisor, John Bolton. A judge will decide in the next 24 hours whether the publication can go ahead next week as planned. But plenty of extracts have already been published in the press, and they are not flattering for the president, to say the least. John Bolton says Donald Trump approached China's president for help in getting re-elected. Mr. Bolton writes, he stressed the importance of farmers and increased Chinese purchases of soybeans and wheat in the electoral outcome. This is John Bolton being interviewed on American TV.
You say that you were astonished by what you saw. A president for whom getting re-elected was the only thing that mattered, even if it meant endangering or weakening the nation?
Well, I think he was so focused on the re-election that longer-term considerations fell by the wayside.
Well, Mr. Bolton has also accused Mr. Trump of telling Xi Jinping that building internment camps for Uyghur Muslims was exactly the right thing to do. It's worth noting that the US State Department says China subjects people in those camps to torture, physical abuse and prolonged detention without trial because of their religion and ethnicity. Here's some more of that interview.
You described the president as erratic, foolish, behaved irrationally, bizarrely. You can't leave him alone for a minute. He saw conspiracies behind rocks and was stunningly uninformed. He couldn't tell the difference between his personal interests and the country's interests.
I don't think he's fit for office. I don't think he has the competence to carry out the job. There really isn't any guiding principle that I was able to discern other than what's good for Donald Trump's reelection.
Well, as is customary for the president, Donald Trump fired back on Twitter. He called John Bolton a wacko and says the book is full of lies and fake stories. He goes on, a disgruntled, boring fool who only wanted to go to war, never had a clue, was ostracised and happily dumped. What a dope! Exclamation mark. Well, the president also did the rounds on American media, talking up his own record. This was him on Fox News.
Nobody has been tough on China, and nobody has been tough on Russia like I have. And that's in the record books, and it's not even close. The last administration did nothing on either. And then in terms of Bolton, he broke the law. He was a washed-up guy. I gave him a chance. He couldn't get Senate confirmed, so I gave him a non-Senate confirmed position where I could just put him there, see how he worked.
Yeah, he's not happy, is he? Well, just to be clear, Donald Trump is claiming John Bolton broke the law by publishing classified information, but no court has agreed with that assessment so far. This isn't the first time that Donald Trump has turned on a former staffer. He's also had more opportunities than most to do so. This is a graph from the American think tank Brookings. The red bars show the total turnover executive staff during a president's term. That's President Trump's bar on the far right. There's been a turnover of staff in 88% of positions. That's the highest over the past 40 years. When former Secretary of State Rex Tillerson said the president was undisciplined and didn't read briefing reports, the president responded by calling him as dumb as a rock and lazy as hell. President Trump called his former Defense Secretary Jim Mattis the world's most overrated general and said former Chief of Staff John Kelly was in way over his head and couldn't keep his mouth shut. The former White House Press Secretary Anthony Scaramucci has become a fierce critic of Donald Trump, and the president is now a fierce critic of him. Nobody ever heard of this dope until he met me. He only lasted 11 days. Anthony Scaramucci has been talking about what it's like to fall out with the president. This is what he had to say.
It's Trump employment syndrome. You try to like President Trump, you end up working for him, you experience the blowback, the insecurity, the shrapnel, the litany of lies, and then you start various coping mechanisms.
You know, there were gasps, Anthony, when I was reading that out. 88% of a turnover of staff under the Trump administration. I mean, he's trying his best to block this publication for John Bolton's book, but already the juicy bits are out there, aren't they?
Yeah, it is. I mean, you know, that ship has sailed. They may be able to block the publication. It's a kind of a last-ditch effort, but with all of these reports already getting out in the media, the most damaging details of John Bolton's book are going to be in the public. So there's not a whole lot they can do to stop that. In fact, maybe it is even drawing more attention to John Bolton's book. I wouldn't be surprised if it tops the bestsellers charts partially because of what the Trump administration is trying to do in reaction to it.
Anthony, I want to get your reaction to another development, and this has to do with Facebook that made this announcement that it has taken down posts from the Trump re-election campaign because they violated the social network's policy against organised hate. One is reported to have complained of dangerous mobs of far-left groups destroying our cities and rioting, and including a red triangle upside down, the symbol for political prisoners in Nazi concentration camps. Anthony, what is your reaction to that? And have we heard anything from Donald Trump on this?
We haven't heard anything specifically from Donald Trump. We've heard from his campaign, however. They said that the upside-down red triangle is a symbol that Antifa itself uses, and that there's a red upside-down triangle emoji on the Facebook page. So if this were a controversial image, they certainly didn't know about it. But I think what the significance of this is it's showing that Facebook may be starting to move towards regulating the Trump campaign's postings a little more. If you remember, when Twitter took down several of Donald Trump's tweets just a few weeks ago, Facebook and Mark Zuckerberg came out and said, well, you know, we don't really get into policing the speech of politicians. So this is perhaps a sign that Facebook may be reversing course a bit.
Anthony Zurcher on a very busy day for the Trump administration. Stay with us here on Outside Source, still to come. As the UK announces it's ditched its existing track and trace virus app, we've looked at how the system is working or not around the world. The singer Dame Vera Lynn has died at the age of 103. Known as the Force's sweetheart, she entertained troops on the front line during the Second World War. She never retired. Last month, she became the oldest artist to reach the top 40 in the UK album charts. Here's historian Dr. Helen Fry on her legacy.
I think her biggest legacy is raising the morale not only of the armed forces right across, and that includes not only in Europe but of course in the Far East. She was out in Burma and travelled to India and performed to the troops, but also the nation. You know, we struggled at a time when, well, particularly in the early part of the war, you know, the nation's survival was on the line, and she gave hope, she gave that resilience. She's almost a sort of, if I may compare her, sort of that spirit of Churchill in a way, you know, that strength that saw us through some of the most darkest moments of that war.
Outside Source, live from the BBC Newsroom. I'm Babita Sharma. The US Supreme Court rules against the Trump administration's bid to deport hundreds of thousands of immigrants who were brought to the US illegally as children. Let's take a look at some of the day's other news. And Russia's ambassador in Germany has rejected as groundless accusations by German federal prosecutors that Moscow ordered the killing of a former Chechen rebel commander last August. Earlier, prosecutors charged a Russian national with the murder of a Georgian national of Chechen origin. The victim was shot dead in a Berlin park. This picture has been released by the Indian authorities. It shows a crude weapon purportedly being used by the Chinese forces in the fatal clashes along the China's disputed border with India on Monday. The fight in the Galwan Valley left at least 20 Indian soldiers dead and raised tensions between the two powers. The French president has been in London for ceremonies to mark the 80th anniversary of the Charles de Gaulle BBC broadcast that urged the people of France to resist the Nazi invasion. President Macron met Boris Johnson in Downing Street, where they also discussed quarantine rules for people travelling to the UK from abroad. To date, over 450,000 people around the world have died because of coronavirus. But the BBC has found the pandemic's real toll is far higher. Analysis shows that another 130,000 people have died than would normally be expected if 2020 was any other year. This is what's known as excess deaths. Out of the 27 countries we looked at, Ecuador has seen twice as many deaths since the outbreak there began, with a 108% rise in the mortality rate compared to other years. In Italy, there was a 40% rise in the number of deaths, and elsewhere in Europe, the figures in Spain and Belgium were also disturbing. And 55% more people than usual died in Indonesia's capital of Jakarta. Sophia Betiza has more.
A father buries his youngest son. A mother, distraught. 3-year-old Rafa did not have coronavirus, but his parents say he died because of it. He had leukemia. When his condition got worse, his parents raced to hospital.
It was around midnight. The hospital said he would need it to be tested for COVID-19 before he could be admitted anywhere. Another hospital told us there wasn't a children's doctor on duty, and the quick COVID tests they had were only being used for pregnant women.
Rafa's parents drove him to 3 more hospitals that night, with no success. The next day, they eventually found a hospital that would accept him, but he died before doctors could see him.
I still believe that if my son was given prompt treatment, he would still be alive.
Rafa is one of tens of thousands of people whose deaths are not officially counted as being caused by coronavirus, but are still victims of this pandemic. Since the outbreak of the virus, lots of countries are recording more deaths than usual. You can see a bump in the graph here. These are called excess deaths. Now, many of these have officially been linked to coronavirus, as you can see here in red. But that still leaves a huge number of lives lost, which are not accounted for in the COVID statistics.
Sophia Batiza there reporting. Well, one of the countries we haven't included in our analysis is India, because we don't have good enough data yet. Even before the pandemic, only 70% of deaths in the country are formally recorded, and only 1 in 5 deaths are certified by a doctor. So far, India has recorded more than 12,000 coronavirus deaths since the start of the pandemic. But that is likely only a small part of the overall picture before you count overall excess deaths in the same period. Well, here's one epidemiologist in India to explain some reasons why the number of deaths in the country has been relatively low.
So the deaths reported in India have increased over the last 10 years. It has increased from 69 to around 78%. So, and death registration is compulsory as per the civil registration system, which is mandatory for any passing of any inheritance. Therefore, it is followed in most urban areas. However, in rural areas, it is yet to pick up. So nearly 20%, there is an improvement needed there. As an epidemiologist, a trained epidemiologist in the University of California, Los Angeles, and working in India for a long time, I can tell you with certainty that we are not missing the numbers, missing a major number of deaths related to coronavirus. However, there are reasons why we are having lower number of deaths. Number one, younger population. Number two, we are still in the ascending phase or early phase of the coronavirus epidemic in India. As we move forward, we will get the numbers. Currently, we are around 9 per million deaths in India, which is approximately, much lesser compared to the entire world, which is having around 200 plus deaths. So we will have increased availability of data in the future. But more importantly, and this is my hypothesis as of now, Indians might have had cross-infection with the other types of coronavirus earlier. Therefore, most young people would have had probably immunity for even the novel coronavirus. And only future examinations might reveal this.
Dr. Giridhar Babu there. In Russia, a health watchdog has reported that nearly 500 medics have died after contracting COVID-19. That's a big increase from just over 100 doctors, nurses and other health workers who were reported to have died last month. Russian authorities say problems in supplying protective equipment were a contributing factor. Sarah Rainsford reports.
First of all, after this head of the watchdog, the health watchdog here, made this statement and talked about 489 medical workers losing their lives in this COVID pandemic, the watchdog itself then backtracked and said that these were not official statistics, that she was in fact citing an unofficial tally that's kept by medical workers themselves. But I think even so, it's very interesting that this watchdog, a very official body, is keeping clearly a very close eye on that unofficial tally. The official numbers for now are 3 weeks old. They talk about 101 medical workers having lost their lives so far. But even so, during this conference, it was a conference online about medical safety. The watchdog head talked about serious shortcomings that there had been, particularly at the very beginning of the outbreak of COVID-19 here in Russia, talking about the dire shortage of PPE and saying, was there more that we could have done to prevent medical workers dying? She said that was a question, and the answer coming from this official was yes, there was. And here there is a very clear political context for this. Just a week or so ago, Russia basically declared victory over coronavirus. There was seen to be a stabilization in terms of the number of cases being reported every day, and certainly the number of fatalities, specifically talking about here in Moscow as the heart of the epidemic. But that seems to be because there is a whole raft of very important political dates coming up. First of all, the Victory Day parade on the 24th of June, and then following that, a key vote for President Putin on constitutional reforms that will allow him to stay in power for another 2 terms. And it seems quite clear that the relaxation of restrictions that we've seen in coronavirus terms over the past few days, much more people on the streets, much more things opening up, is very clearly linked to the political agenda here. So there's a lot of concern that this opening up, whilst it's very welcome, people were very frustrated with the lockdown here, could very well lead to another increase in cases very soon.
Sarah Rainsford reporting. The UK has announced a change of strategy in its efforts to track and trace COVID-19. It's ditched its existing plan for a virus app in exchange for one created by Apple and Google. Track and trace is of huge importance because it's seen as central to controlling the virus while lockdowns are eased. And the UK is far from the only country grappling with how to implement it effectively. Ross Atkins has more.
Around the world, lockdowns are easing, and a new approach is taking centre stage.
Tracing and quarantining every contact.
We will have a test, track and trace operation that will be world-beating.
We need that tool so we can open up the economy.
But can track and trace deliver, and can we trust it? Time and again in March, we heard about flattening the curve, and in most countries, it's happened. These are infection rates in the UK, Italy and France. And because of graphs like these, lockdowns are being eased. But now attention's turning to controlling new outbreaks. The WHO is clear. When systematically applied, contact tracing will break the chains of transmission of an infectious disease and thus is an essential public health tool. So what is contact tracing? Well, this is about countries knowing who has the virus and who they've been in contact with. But it comes in many forms. Some systems are digital, some manual, some both. Some are voluntary, like in Australia, Germany and Singapore. Some, such as China and South Korea, are definitely not. And however you do this, there are major challenges. One of the reasons is personal data. Phones are being used to monitor proximity to other people and location, and the data is not always anonymized. China and South Korea monitor the location of people who have the virus and their payment history, and they don't ask permission, and both have largely tracked the virus effectively. But in South Korea, at least, there's awareness this approach is unusual.
확보할 수 있단 말이죠. 이거 사실은 아주 무서운 현실입니다. 그러나 감염병 사태가 아니라면 절대 그래서는 안 되지만.
Scary is the word for many people, unacceptably scary, whatever the public health benefits. Amnesty International has warned Bahrain, Kuwait and Norway's contact tracing apps are highly invasive surveillance tools. Well, now Norway's suspended its app, and Germany's been mindful of these concerns. Its app doesn't log your location. But there's an acknowledged tension here between protecting people's privacy and how well the virus is tracked. And then there's the challenge of getting people to sign up. The more people, the more effective the system. But if you're a democracy, getting most people to take part is hard. Singapore wanted 3/4 of people to have its app. It got 1/3, and not all of them are using it. One senior official says there's a trust issue. Australia's target was 40%. So far it's reached 25%, though its success containing COVID-19 does mean it has less need for the app. The remaining challenge is that you need an app that works. In Moscow, a quarantine tracking app has been fining people for being outside when they weren't. Australia's app has struggled to get Bluetooth connections with all contacts nearby. And then there's England. In May, the government said people had a duty to download its app and that it would launch after a trial. Now, though, we're told this.
We're seeking to get something going for the winter, but it isn't the priority for us at the moment.
And the UK government announced it's scrapping its first plan in favour of a version which collects less data. And its reasoning offers an insight into the issues around digital tracking.
And in fact, there is a danger of being too technological and relying too much on text and emails and alienating or freaking out people.
Which leads us to manual track and trace. In other words, tracking done by people. We know from Ebola, smallpox and HIV, this can be highly effective, arguably the most effective measure. But among the world's most affected countries during this pandemic, while America and Brazil's manual tracking is piecemeal, and in England's case, remember Boris Johnson's promise? Well, here's the New York Times. England's world-beating system to track the virus is anything but. And we know in its first week, this system referred over 8,000 people with COVID-19, over 5,000 of them handed over their contacts, and around 30,000 of those contacts agreed to self-isolate. It's a start, but like in many countries with high case numbers, it's far from comprehensive. Contact tracing is billed as the bridge between now and a vaccine. For all the reasons discussed, we're still in the early stages of building it.
Ross Atkins with that report. That's about it from the team here on Outside Source. You can, of course, get in touch with us. We'd love to hear from you on Twitter. I'm at Babita TV. Of course, keep up to date with all the news on the BBC News website. We'll see you again soon. Goodbye.